Joey Ryan first started appearing for TNA Wrestling in 2012 when he was a contestant on Gut Check, which was pretty much TNA's kayfabe Tough Enough. Joey had been a regular on the independent scene and PWG by this point and had also wrestled in Rinker King, which was the Indian wrestling promotion backed by Jeff Jarrett and TNA. Joey Ryan did not succeed in Gut Check and getting a kayfabe contract, but in real life he had indeed signed the TNA contract and was a regular now on the TNA roster, and he was kind of in the early stages of that sleazebag gimmick he did that we all know and hate, as he would earn his kayfabe TNA contract by defeating Al Snow of all people at Bound for Glory 2012. Yes, that's a real singles match that happened at Bound for Glory. But Joey Ryan in his first stint in TNA wouldn't stick around for very long. He was only there until midway through of the next year, as he would end up being released from TNA in his first initial run in July of 2013, and he spent most of his TNA run just being a lower card jobber guy. He was never really a heavy hitter in any of the divisions, just a face in the company. But just over 5 years later, Joey Ryan would make his return to TNA, now called Impact Wrestling, as he officially re-debuted at Bound for Glory 2019. He had done some occasional appearances up until that point, and of course by this point he was full in with that sleazebag gimmick, doing the dick suplexes and all that other bullshit. And initially he was continuing that gimmick in TNA after he re-debuted for them, but he would get tweaked, his character would get changed, as he would be renamed to Joseph P. Ryan, playing a Right to Censor-esque character and leading a stable called Cancel Culture alongside Rob Van Dam and Katie Forbes, as they would start out 2020 with this new angle, and it seemed to be a new beginning for Joey Ryan in TNA. However, this angle would not last very long, as within just a couple of months the pandemic would take place and TNA would be forced to go off the air. And of course, during the pandemic, the speaking out movement would take place, with over a dozen women coming out to accuse Joey Ryan of sexual misconduct, with other indie wrestlers and former associates of Joey Ryan coming out to back up these claims. And this of course led to Joey Ryan totally being deleted from the entire wrestling industry, as he was fired from TNA in June of 2020, that same month he was accused, and Joey Ryan was blackballed from the entire wrestling industry, just as it seemed as though he was kind of doing something interesting for once in his career and something actually different. But alas, Joey Ryan being out of wrestling is nothing but a net positive for the wrestling industry and community. Next up is Michael Elgin, who was an independent wrestling icon in the 2000s and finally got signed to a TV company with TNA in 2019, but his career would also come crashing down after the speaking out movement. On June 22nd, 2014, wrestler Michael Elgin became the Ring of Honor World Champion, beating Adam Cole for the title at Ring of Honor Best in the World 2014. It was perhaps the biggest championship Elgin had ever won in his 10th year of his professional wrestling career, as up until this point, Elgin had been a stalwart of the independent scene, having wrestled and been very successful in many companies, including but not limited to Combat Zone Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, IWA Mid-South, and he also wrestled for companies in other countries such as DDT and New Japan. Michael Elgin would hold the Ring of Honor title until September of that year, losing it to Jay Briscoe, but even though he lost it, Michael Elgin was now in the best years of his career. He'd work more with New Japan through Ring of Honor's working relationship with them, and would start getting very popular in New Japan Pro Wrestling. He'd win the Never Openweight 6-man tag titles alongside Tanahashi and Yoshitatsu, and they would feud with the Elite over them, which also saw Elgin defeating Kenny Omega to win the IWGP Intercontinental title. At the end of 2017, Michael Elgin began teaming with Jeff Cobb in the Global Tag League, but behind the scenes, a lot was going on. And that's because in December of 2017, a woman accused one of Michael Elgin's trainees of SA, with the woman sharing multiple screenshots of DMs between herself and Elgin, accusing him of mishandling the allegations and ignoring them, choosing to do nothing about it. Screenshots were also released showing him making disparaging remarks about his tag partner Jeff Cobb. Following these allegations, Elgin was pulled from many indie promotions' dates. However, New Japan did keep him around and kept him teaming with Jeff Cobb a little while longer, which must have been super awkward. And the rest of Elgin's run in New Japan was awkward in general. He won the Never Openweight title in 2018 to the shock of many fans. However, he was eventually let go in April of 2019. He then signed to TNA in 2019, where he didn't really do much, and then during the speaking out movement in 2020, the allegations against Michael Elgin resurfaced, as well as new allegations of him sending explicit photos to a woman, which also surfaced. TNA at first suspended him indefinitely, but he was eventually fired as a result of these allegations. He would mostly disappear from wrestling, where he would occasionally work the indies, and he had a run-in with the law during this time, as in July of 2021, he was arrested after violating a protection order filed by his ex-fiancée. No charges were filed in the end, and in 2022, after 2 years of inactivity, Elgin would make appearances for Pro Wrestling Noah in Japan, and even win the GHC tag titles. However, just 2 months later, he was stripped of the titles and removed from future Noah shows due to his run-ins with the Japanese law. The crime, you ask? Shoplifting protein powder. Yes, he was supposedly in trouble for shoplifting protein powder, and whilst Elgin denies this, he was never invited back to a Noah show ever again, and those Noah shows were back in 2022, and they were his last real big opportunity and platform that he had, and nowadays he only occasionally works for low-level indie promotions. Next up is Alberto Del Rio, or Alberto El Patron as he was known in TNA, who goes down as maybe one of the most controversial wrestlers still in the industry in a pretty mainstream spot. As Alberto Del Rio initially debuted for WWE in 2010, but would leave WWE in 2014 after slapping a worker in WWE who allegedly made a racial joke towards him. He would return back to WWE the next year, but within just a year and a half, he was already opting out of his contract due to what he believed was mistreatment from within the company and not booking him correctly, as he would debut for TNA during the Impact Wrestling tapings on 2nd of March 2017, and would very quickly win the GFW Global Championship on TNA. Confusing, I know, but this was the very weird TNA/GFW era that the company had, where they were both merged together. And as Global Champion, he would then go on to defeat Bobby Lashley, who was the TNA World Champion at Slammiversary, to unify both the belts, as Alberto El Patron had effectively been chosen as the figurehead to lead this TNA/GCW merger. Probably the worst combination of words I've ever said in a video, and an idea that I have no idea why anyone thought would ever work. Yeah, let's combine TNA with a property nobody's ever heard of in GFW and have this problematic guy as the lead face. And very quickly this would be proven to be a poor decision, as just 10 days later El Patron was suspended from TNA due to a personal domestic violence incident involving his then girlfriend Paige, of course a WWE wrestler at the time, and he would end up getting stripped of the title as a result of this suspension, having never even defended it. Worst of all though, TNA would bring him back to the company despite all the controversy, as he returned in November of 2017 at Bound for Glory, as he would start slowly working his way back up the ranks in TNA, but once again this would prove to be a very bad decision from TNA again, as in just months he would end up getting released and fired from TNA, as on the 7th of April 2018 there was a Lucha Ground vs Impact Wrestling event going on during WrestleMania week, and guess who no-showed the event? Alberto El Patron, and he was fired for this and has never appeared in TNA since, though he continues on in AAA and continues to find himself in trouble with the law. And finally is Austin Aries, who goes down as one of the greatest workers in TNA history and one of the best wrestlers they've had. However, he's probably going to be remembered more for his controversies and drama surrounding him. Austin Aries began his pro wrestling training in the year 2000 and would make his debut that same year in November. He would start wrestling for various indie promotions, but his first somewhat breakout would come in 2004 when he made his debut for Ring of Honor on April 24th. And by the end of 2004, he was the Ring of Honor World Champion, having beaten Samoa Joe for the belt. He'd hold the title for about 6 months before losing it to CM Punk, and he would continue to grow his career, as in 2005, he would make the next step up and debut for TNA. He debuted at Sacrifice 05 as a pole option to face Christopher Daniels, and he would win the pole, but not win the match. However, his performance was enough to impress TNA officials that they signed him to a contract, and Aries was now signed to both TNA and Ring of Honor and a regular member on both rosters. He would continue to find success in both companies, as in TNA he formed a stable with Alex Shelley and Roderick Strong, who he was already teaming with on Ring of Honor alongside Jack Evans. Aries and Strong would win the Ring of Honor tag titles in December 2005, and things were looking good, but 3 months later, the first signs of Austin Aries' attitude problems began to show. As in February 2006, Austin Aries as well as Roderick Strong was suspended from TNA for arriving 4 hours late to the Against All Odds pay-per-view. And this happened because Aries and Strong had just been in Long Island for a Ring of Honor show, and TNA officials had requested them to drive down to Tampa for Against All Odds a little earlier than originally planned, as there was a snowstorm, but Aries and Strong decided not to travel early despite the advice and stay for longer, thus causing them to be late. Something that was very clearly avoidable. And when he would return to TNA, it was under the new name and gimmick of Austin Starr, and he would join up with the X Division, where you'll most likely remember him from Paparazzi Productions. 2007 would be an eventful year for him, as on April 18th, Austin Starr was suspended from TNA for 90 days. This was due to TNA requesting him to film vignettes on what he saw as his day off, and though he did ultimately agree to do them, TNA weren't happy with his attitude again, and thus he was suspended. And then 2 weeks later, it was announced that Ring of Honor had signed a new pay-per-view deal, and with that, TNA pulled Austin Aries from all Ring of Honor shows. However, also during this suspension, Austin Starr would request his release from TNA, it was granted, and he returned back to Ring of Honor in June. And he'd spend the next 3 years in Ring of Honor, where he was once again a top star for them, and he would win the world title once again. He left Ring of Honor in 2010 to join Dragon Gate, as he had a short run that only lasted 8 months, as he left to pursue a career outside of wrestling, as he was considering retiring. But this decision would be reversed, as he was offered to return to TNA, and he took that offer. He returned back under the name of Austin Aries again in June of 2011, joining back up with the X Division, and by September, he was the X Division champion. And Austin Aries would have an all-timer X Division title reign here. In fact, it's the longest TNA X Division title reign in TNA history, as he held it for 301 days, holding the belt until July of 2012 with a great catalogue of matches and title defenses. And in fact, he would never even lose the belt, as instead, the Option C rule was introduced. Austin Aries was not satisfied with being just the X Division champion, so the Option C rule was introduced by Hulk Hogan, which allowed the X Division champion to relinquish the belt to challenge for the world title. And thus, Austin Aries would vacate the belt and challenge Bobby Roode for the world title at Destination X, and he would win the world title. In just over a year since returning, Austin Aries had become one of TNA's top guys. He'd hold the title for 98 days, it was a shorter but still sweet reign, as he lost the belt to Jeff Hardy at Bound for Glory. His next title reign would be a tag title reign alongside Bobby Roode, as they won the titles in January 2013, holding them for a couple of months. And one time while they were making their entrance, Austin Aries would get himself into trouble, as during their entrance, ring announcer Christy Hemme messed up the announcement, leading Austin Aries to charge to the ring, corner Christy Hemme, and get on the middle rope to taunt. It's not a good image, and Christy Hemme was unhappy and uncomfortable with what took place. TNA fined Austin Aries, and Aries apologized to Hemme, which she was said to be satisfied with. And other than that, it doesn't seem as though Aries found himself in much other trouble in this TNA run, and he would exit TNA in 2015 after 5 X Division title reigns, a tag title reign, and a world title reign. He had done everything there was to do, and the only next step was to go to the WWE. He would sign to the WWE in January 2016 and go to NXT. he would have a decent run in NXT and was even set to reunite with Roderick Strong in the Dusty Cup, but he had to withdraw due to injury, and this injury would end his NXT run altogether. As during his injury, he'd start doing commentary on the main roster for 205 Live and Cruiserweight division segments, and in March 2017, he would return to the ring and turn face by attacking Cruiserweight champion Neville. He would challenge Neville for the title numerous times, first at WrestleMania 33 in an underrated match where he came short, and he challenged again at Payback but won by DQ, and then he challenged again at Extreme Rules in a submission match but was tapped out, and then shortly after this, out of nowhere, it was found out that Austin Aries had been released. It was shocking to hear this news given he was just in a 3-month title program, but lo and behold, his attitude came back to bite him, as apparently Austin Aries was not popular backstage, including amongst WWE officials, and thus Aries was let go. Austin Aries' attitude had got him in trouble before with suspensions and fines, but never a firing. Until now. And of course, Aries would return to the Indies and back to TNA again, as he returned in 2018 alongside all the belts he had won upon his Indies return, dubbing himself the Belt Collector. And he would expand his collection by quickly winning both the TNA World and Grand Championships, as Austin Aries was back to life in TNA again, and during his time as World Champ, he would feud with Johnny Impact. They would have a match set for Bound for Glory 2018, and in the lead up to the match, Aries and Impact would exchange words on Twitter, which had fans questioning if they were worked or not, where Johnny Impact was making fun of Aries' height, and Aries didn't seem to be reacting well. One very interesting and infamous tweet from Aries read, the form of discrimination that's still super cool. Short shaming. If I joked race, retards, your gay look, if I fat shamed your husky wife, instant outrage, but you can predictably cutter me over my height, genetics I don't control, and it's just funny. This tweet supposedly didn't go down well with TNA, and it also came out later that Austin Aries and Johnny Impact hadn't agreed with TNA to have an online feud leading up to the match, and these tweets of course got quite the reaction from the fans. But at Bound for Glory itself, in the match, Johnny would defeat Aries before Austin Aries would completely just get up and no-sell the finish, just straight up walking away before flipping off the fans and TNA officials. What just happened? This was Aries' last appearance for TNA, and to this day, nobody knows what really happened here, and it's always been assumed that Austin Aries did this on his own accord, but there are various reports that say this happened due to Aries being concussed, and Aries was apparently at the next TNA tapings but was sent home, and then Aries has also said before himself that this no-sell was planned and he was meant to return to TNA, so nobody really knows. It's confusing all round, but alas, Aries hasn't returned to TNA and hasn't really done much at all in wrestling since. In 2020, various allegations were made against Austin Aries by numerous alleged victims, accusing him of various forms of predatory behavior, including a woman who claims that while at a show, she was made to bend down and kiss Austin Aries' testicles. Aries would release a long statement in response where essentially says he isn't perfect, but he's not a predator, and that the Austin Aries character isn't representative of who he is as a person. But after this, Austin Aries' career was all but dead. Nowadays, he works for low-level indies, and the only two promotions you might recognize that he's worked for somewhat recently are NWA and Control Your Narrative, which is just so predictable, right? He was only in the NWA for a short period of time from 2021 to 2022. He was there for a few months, part of a tournament, which made it to the finals of but lost. And he was also on a few of the Control Your Narrative shows, a company which died a quick death, as it was probably the worst wrestling promotion of all time. And since then, like I said, it's been pretty much nothing from Austin Aries, and it's safe to say his wrestling career is pretty dead in the water.